This is the place where civilization began, and today it behaves like a ticking bomb. So why does the cradle of humanity keep tearing itself apart? And why do most of us understand almost none of it? Start with the name. The Middle East is a European label for a space that holds Turkey, Iran, Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. Afghanistan often gets pulled in too, as part of the same axis of wars and outside meddling. But here is the first myth to kill. This is not one culture. There are Arabs, Persians, Turks, Kurds, and dozens of smaller groups, all sharing the same neighborhood. There is no unity in language or religion either. Islam and Arabic dominate, but split into different branches, sects, and dialects. Add countless minorities and you get a mosaic, not a monolith. Even the states are built differently. Oil monarchies in the Gulf, countries that tried to be secular, then ran back to religion as the source of power. Some are cracked nations that work more like a patchwork of zones than a country. And here is the part that makes it global. Through this region run the most important routes of trade and energy on Earth. So a local quarrel almost automatically becomes a world problem. So forget the phrase, the conflict in the Middle East. It is not one conflict. It is a whole knot of wars, unrest, terror, and tangled politics that nobody has managed to unravel in over a century. To see why, we have to rewind. Look at the map and you see countries and borders. Normally, borders come from something, a river, a mountain, or the tribes and peoples who actually live there. Hold that thought, because this is where the modern nightmare begins. Imagine a region with dozens of ethnic groups and faiths living side by side. The worst thing you could possibly do is force rigid borders on it from above for someone else's interest. No looking at who lives with who trades, who marries, who migrates. That is almost exactly what happened. In 1916, in the middle of the First World War, French and British diplomats quietly carved up the future spoils of the Ottoman Empire, just in case they won. Then the Allies did win, and suddenly those careless pencil lines became real borders. Almost overnight, new mandates, new administrations, and new states appeared. Most of these states were artificial geographic constructions that did not fit the human fabric underneath. Tribes and peoples who had lived beside each other for generations were sliced apart by lines and reclassified as an administrative problem. A region once bound by relationships turned into a mosaic of competing territories, and inside each one, a poisonous question began to spread. Why should I be a minority in a country that was never mine? It is easy to shrug and say they always fought over there. Comfortable and false. For a long time, diversity was just everyday life, and the old empires somehow kept it in check. Not because they were fair or tolerant, because they ruled with flexible, multi-layered systems where identity was fluid. The problem was never that people were different. It was what got done with that difference when states were built from a foreign template. From there, much of the region's history reads like one long chain of consequences from a single mistake. Instead of building stability on rules that actually work, people were thrown into borders that made sense mainly to someone on the outside. Then the first half of the 20th century rewired the whole planet, and this region with it. Local national dreams grew, pushed by ambitious local elites. But before they could fully bloom, the Second World War exploded. One of its biggest consequences here was the birth of Israel, and it knocked over the entire regional domino set. Suddenly, in the heart of the region, a new state existed. For one side, it was the fulfillment of a national project and an answer to the catastrophe of European anti-Semitism. For the other, it meant dispossession, lost homes, and humiliation. That is why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is so toxic and so close to unsolvable. It is not only about borders, it is about narrative, dignity, and memory. And those do not split down the middle. Meanwhile, some peoples were left with no state at all. Palestinians ended up suspended between occupation, paper autonomy, and dependence on other people's decisions. The Kurds were split across several countries, a nation whose dreams keep falling into the gears of other people's interests. And in a setup like this, no crisis ever ends cleanly. Every war, coup, uprising, and escalation is plugged into a bigger system of unfinished business. Pull one thread, and three more move. Then came the 1970s, and a shift many in the West missed because they were staring at oil and the price of the pump. In several countries, regimes rose where religion became the core and the unquestionable license for their rule. Because if power comes from God, there is nothing left to argue about. Iran, after the 1979 revolution, became the symbol of that term. Religious law was first a tool of mobilization, then of social control, then a project of influence pushed abroad through networks of allies and proxies. Afghanistan and Iraq added the next lesson. When a state collapses or is broken, the empty space fills with movements that promise order, meaning, and justice, even if their order means even more violence. And once you let the language of the absolute into politics, God wills it, the nation must. Compromise starts to feel impossible, because compromise becomes easy to brand as betrayal. Hold that idea. It comes back at the very end. Now add the oil. Finding enormous reserves poured fuel on the fire, literally and politically. On one side, it let some Gulf states leapfrog whole stages of development, from desert frontier with nomadic tribes to rich, hyper-organized financial hubs. On the other side, oil created a state that does not have to bargain with its people over taxes and representation. It lives off resource rent instead. In that model, power can simply buy loyalty, and when buying stops working, it uses force. Black gold also dragged in the interests of great powers and corporations. Control over energy and routes is not about prestige, it is raw economic advantage. So the region became an arena where foreign states and local elites often played the very same game. And that game was stability, meaning keep the convenient arrangement, even if it produces frustration, inequality, and rage. Add military meddling, and radicalization starts running like a production line. Outside interventions, whether sold as fighting communism, fighting terrorism, or restoring order, often shatter a barely functioning state and leave a vacuum. And in that vacuum, the winner is whoever has the weapons, the network, and the story. This is the soil where large protest movements grow that later get labeled terrorist, some ideological, some opportunistic, but all of them feed on the same humiliation, the same lack of a future, the same sense that normal politics simply does not work. After 2001, the cycle sped up. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the fight against Al-Qaeda, then ISIS. It redrew the security map, but never fixed the root problem: weak institutions, deep divisions, and a constant scramble for influence. So here is the master key. Today, almost every conflict here runs on two levels. Locally, it is about power, security, resources, identity, sometimes revenge and memory. Geopolitically, it is about who controls the routes, the energy, the alliances, and the security architecture. And that is exactly where the outside powers walk in. The United States was long the main guarantor of order, and sometimes the main source of chaos. With huge military bases, alliances, and pressure, China came in differently, through investment, infrastructure, trade, and diplomacy that tries to slip into the cracks between America and its partners. Russia plays selectively, not as an architect, but as a spoiler who can wreck deals or prop up a chosen side. After the fall of Assad, it looks like it no longer has the muscle to play in the top league there. And Europe is close and economically tied, but acts incoherently, with no single policy on Israel, Palestine, Iran, or migration. Then comes the regional rivalry that works like an engine for proxy wars. Saudi Arabia and Iran spent years competing for primacy, often dressing it in religious language, while it was really about influence, security, and the model of the state. Turkey pushes in, mixing security, borders, and the ambition to be a bigger player, sometimes with the West, sometimes against it. Israel sees everything through deterrence, leaning toward preventive action over long compromise. And the Emirates and Qatar play it clever, with soft power and money, backing different sides depending on the map. The result is brutal. Many wars look like internal conflicts, but in the background the sponsors are fighting. And these wars do not end when the locals run out of strength. They end when the sponsors decide the game no longer pays. And notice this, religion matters, but not in the silly sense of they hate each other over faith. Religion is a tool. It legitimizes power, organizes identity, and gives a language of mobilization. That is what makes the religious layer so dangerous. If a conflict is sold as holy, then any agreement starts to look like apostasy, and worse, Faith gets used cynically by secular politicians who are not pious at all, but know the language hits emotions and shuts down debate. Now look at the institutions that should calm all this. The Arab League is largely a discussion forum, frozen by consensus rules and vetoes. When a crisis erupts, it can often do little more than release a statement. The Gulf Cooperation Council is sharper, but undercut by the rivalries of states that are formally one family, yet really compete for influence and business. So the region runs on a web of temporary deals. An agreement here, a normalization there, secret talks somewhere else. But there is no overall architecture that could force de-escalation. Nothing like a regional NATO that everyone has to obey. And the global bill lands on you, even far away. Terrorism mutated from desert armies into networks that survive losing their land and operate online, inspiring attacks and recruiting vulnerable people on the other side of the planet. Then there is trade and energy. Let the route through the Red Sea near the Suez Canal turn risky, and shipping costs jump while economies from Europe to Asia start gasping. Recent attacks on shipping forced longer routes that hammered supply chains and Suez revenues. That is the essence of Middle Eastern globality. A local conflict can walk into your shop as a fuel price, into your factory as a delayed delivery, and into your politics as migration and social tension. Now a fast tour, country by country, because the region is not uniform, just wired by the same mechanisms. Turkey blends domestic politics with geopolitics, sitting inside NATO while playing a hard game over its own spheres of influence, balancing the US and Russia with Kurdish tensions always in the background. In Israel and Palestine, the drama drags in the whole region. It is at once a war, a humanitarian crisis, and a fight over who rules Gaza and the West Bank after each round of violence. Even ceasefires are fragile. And the deeper trap is that managing the conflict has become easier than risking a painful compromise. Iran behaves like a besieged fortress, seeing Western pressure as an attempt to break the regime, while part of society sees the regime itself as the wall blocking normal life. The nuclear program is not just technical, it is symbolic, about deterrence and sovereignty. And as this was written, huge anti-government protests were sweeping the country, so the story is far from over. Syria, more than a year after Assad fell, stays fragile, with real power split between center and periphery, and shaped by outside players. Religious tensions have risen lately, and although years of sanctions are slowly lifting, the state is only beginning to rebuild. Whether its new leader, who has a heavy past, keeps his promises of free elections and tolerance, we will see. Lebanon, once called the Switzerland of the Middle East, must prove it can hold a monopoly on force, yet it cannot easily disarm an actor as strong as Hezbollah without risking an internal earthquake, all on top of a crushing economic and institutional crisis. Iraq earns from oil, but citizens see weak public services and corruption, so frustration never vanishes, it just changes shape. Jordan survives as a buffer between crises, juggling border security, social strain, and the weight of refugees, constantly seeking outside support. Egypt ties its economy to the security of the seas, fights huge youth unemployment, even among graduates, and sits at the center of every talk about Gaza and the Red Sea. So here is the real answer. The biggest problem is not the next war. It is the machine that keeps producing wars. Weak institutions, plus a zero-sum game, plus outside interests, plus the language of the absolute. While that machine runs, the Middle East is not a place doomed to conflict. It is a place where conflict became the system. Knowing even a little is how you stop mistaking fake news for truth and start seeing the region for what it really is.